Trump's trade war with Canada is backfiring spectacularly. And nowhere is this more obvious than in his desperate scramble for Canada's critical minerals. While the president threatens annexation and slaps tariffs on America's closest ally, he's revealed something crucial. The United States desperately needs what Canada has buried beneath its soil. The so-called Ring of Fire in northern Ontario has become ground zero in this escalating conflict, and Indigenous communities are pushing back against both governments trying to exploit their lands. Here's how Trump's aggressive tactics are exposing American vulnerability and why his strategy might just blow up in his face. The Ring of Fire is a crescent-shaped stretch of territory in northern Ontario's James Bay lowlands, about 1,000 kilometers north of Toronto. This remote region is believed to contain massive quantities of the critical minerals needed to power new technologies: chromite, nickel, copper, and platinum group metals that are essential for everything from electric vehicle batteries to cell phones and computers. For years, mining companies have eyed this treasure trove, but large-scale extraction hasn't begun due to the area's remoteness and the massive infrastructure spending required. Then Trump returned to office, and everything changed. His trade war and annexation threats have forced a complete rethinking of Canadian sovereignty and the strategic assets the country can leverage to reduce TS reliance on the United States. Prime Minister Mark Carney has made it clear that U.S.-Canada relations will not return to normal, calling the situation a rupture rather than a transition. He's positioned critical minerals as one of Canada's key weapons in this economic battle, noting that Canada ranks in the top 5 globally for 10 of the world's most important critical minerals, with 40% of the world's listed mining companies based in the country. But here's where Trump's strategy reveals its fundamental weakness. When the president imposed his sweeping tariffs in February 2025, he made a telling exception. The announcement included 25% tariffs on heavy truck imports, 50% on kitchen cabinets and bathroom vanities, 30% on upholstered furniture, and even 100% on branded pharmaceutical products. Yet while most Canadian goods face these punishing 25% tariffs, energy materials, including critical minerals, only face 10% tariffs. This isn't mercy, it's desperation. As mining expert Elizabeth Stein explains, if the United States didn't really need these materials, they would have been tariffed at 25% as well. The lower rate is a clear admission that America cannot function without Canadian critical minerals. The numbers tell the story of American dependence. Canada is literally the storehouse of every critical mineral that American industry needs, according to Jack Lifton, co-chair of the Critical Mineral Institute. The United States is one of the largest importers of gallium, niobium, aluminum, palladium, platinum, and dozens of other minerals crucial to renewable energy, electronics, and military technology. Yet instead of working cooperatively with their closest ally, Trump has chosen confrontation, a strategy that's already showing signs of strain. The immediate economic impact has been devastating. Markets plummeted when the tariffs were announced, with the Dow Jones falling 1.7% and the S&P 500 dropping 1.4% in a single day.
Of enormous economic pessimism. I don't think the economy is about to crater. I don't think the labor market's about to fall off a cliff. However, the neutral rate is drifting down. And as a result of that, it's incumbent upon policy to adjust in response. And the longer that policy stays excessively restrictive, the greater the risks to the downside for the economy.
And of course, that was the new Fed Governor Stephen Meyer, and they are talking about his argument for greater rate cuts, which of course is sort of undercut by the latest economic data, not to mention, of course, the latest tariff news that we got and potential implications for inflation. For more on all of this, the Fed outlook, market impact, and of course, new tariffs, let's bring in senior editor for markets and Bloomberg opinion columnist John Authers. John, great to have you in Tokyo, but also what a perfect timing, because just 5 minutes before we went on the air, we got these news about new tariffs on truck imports. We still have to sort of analyze what that would mean for the U.S. economy. But overall, when we see all of these news around new levies, what are the implications for the economy?
Right, the implications for the economy can't be great. There is an impression, after we seem to be getting an element of stability for a matter of months on tariffs, as though what in fact we're doing is still playing the game of whack-a-mole, that somewhere else in the trading system the authorities are finding that there's a problem that's been created by the tariffs, and so they're needing to impose fresh ones. I mean, all of the main manufacturers of trucks are from countries where they've already been some kind of a specific deal. So this is some kind of a tacit admission that more needs to be done. The other point I would make is one of the big complaints, obviously I haven't had the time to sit down and analyse this carefully, so this is just a preliminary, the main question in my mind. One of the main complaints that you hear from Detroit, from the US makers, is about the steel and aluminum tariffs, which mean that which have put them at a competitive disadvantage to competitors outside the States. Because
the better-than-expected economic data showing 3.8% GDP growth and strong consumer spending only complicated matters further, as it clouded the outlook for future Federal Reserve rate cuts that markets had been anticipating. The Canadian dollar initially tumbled, but Canada's retaliatory response has been swift and strategic. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau announced $30 billion worth of counter tariffs, with another $125 billion in duties coming within weeks. Ontario Premier Doug Ford has pulled American alcohol worth $1 billion annually from provincial liquor stores and canceled $30 billion in government contracts with U.S. suppliers. But the real battleground isn't just economic, it's about Indigenous rights and sovereignty. Saul Mamakwa, an opposition member of Ontario's provincial parliament representing the area that includes the Ring of Fire, has emerged as a powerful voice against the rush to exploit these resources. Growing up in northern Canada, Mamakwa knew his community's lands held valuable minerals, but he didn't understand the scale until he entered politics. His grandparents and parents always predicted that governments and settlers would eventually want access to these lands because of the minerals. Mamakwa's message is clear and uncompromising. Our lands are not for sale. He argues that any development must follow proper relationship processes that acknowledge the treaties Indigenous communities have with the Crown, ensuring they share in the benefits of the resources. He's particularly critical of using the tariff war as an excuse to override Indigenous rights, warning that you cannot use a tariff war, a tariff issue with the United States of America, to override the rights of the First Nations people that live in these lands. This Indigenous resistance represents a major obstacle that both Trump and Canadian politicians have underestimated. Western university experts have warned against underestimating the challenges ahead, specifically citing opposition from Indigenous communities as a key hurdle. The Ring of Fire sits in Mamakwa's constituency, an area roughly the size of Italy, where multiple First Nations have varying views about mining projects, but united concerns about proper consultation and consent. The legal landscape is shifting in favor of Indigenous rights. Recent federal court decisions under the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act are raising the bar for consultation obligations, potentially changing the regulatory landscape for any prospective developers. As Stein notes, any developer would be playing very riskily if they don't consult to the required depth. Meanwhile, both federal and provincial politicians are scrambling to fast-track development. Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre has promised to approve all federal permits for Ring of Fire mining within 6 months and commit $1 billion to build road networks. Liberal leader Mark Carney has pledged to work closely with Ontario to rapidly develop the region. Ontario has tabled legislation creating special economic zones to speed up large-scale projects, with the Ring of Fire designated as one such zone. But here's the fundamental problem with Trump's approach. He's trying to bully a country that holds the cards. Canada has what America needs, and the more aggressive Trump becomes, the more he reveals American weakness. The fact that he's simultaneously threatening annexation while imposing lower tariffs on the very materials he desperately needs shows a strategy in contradiction with itself. The geopolitical implications extend far beyond North America. Trump has signed executive orders to investigate all U.S. critical minerals imports and increase domestic production, while negotiating deals with war-torn countries like Ukraine and the Democratic Republic of Congo. But these desperate measures only highlight how dependent America has become on foreign sources for essential materials. China has already responded to American tariffs by restricting its exports of rare earth minerals, further squeezing U.S. supply chains. The irony is that Canada, as America's closest ally and most reliable trading partner, would be the natural solution to this problem. Instead, Trump's antagonistic approach is pushing Canada to diversify its markets and reduce its own dependence on the United States.
Official, he's going to continue this behavior, and that's when it got squashed. There are possible criminal charges that could have been brought even before that, including conspiracy and wire fraud and those kind of things. But I can, if I were in the position of the FBI or the prosecutor working with them in last September, I would have also said, okay, let's see how this plays out. But of course, we're not going to see how that plays out.
Indeed. Mary McCord, thanks as always. Good to see you.
My pleasure. Thank you.
It is the World Cup of Global Diplomacy at the United Nations in New York. Hundreds of dignitaries are gathered this week for the UN General Assembly. Tomorrow's first speech to begin the proceedings will come from Brazil's president, Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, known to everyone simply as Lula. The fate of his predecessor, Jair Bolsonaro, who attempted a coup against Lula 2 years ago, has become an explosive issue in U.S.-Brazilian relations. President Trump levied a 50% tariff on many Brazilian goods as a penalty for the prosecution of Bolsonaro. He was convicted earlier this month and sentenced to 27 years in prison. Amna Navaz sat down with Brazil's president this morning in New York.
President Lula, welcome back to the NewsHour. Thank you for joining us.
It's a great pleasure to be here to talk with you again.
I'd love to start with the U.S. tariffs on your country right now, which at 50% are among the highest of any level on any country. You've called them misguided and illogical. How much do you believe that President Trump's anger with the trial and conviction of the former President Jair Bolsonaro, how much did that inform the tariff level on your country?
Well, first of all, Amna, it's unbelievable that President Trump would have this kind of behavior with Brazil due to the judgment of a former president that tried to attempt a coup d'etat against a democratic rule of law, that networked and plotted my death and the assassination of myself, the vice president, and the chief justice of the Supreme Court. So the explanation of a tariff of 50% due to the trial of a former president, this is no explanation for the world's public opinion. And Brazil wants to have a civilized relationship with the U.S. People ask me, do you like President Trump or not? I've never met President Trump, so it's not an issue of whether I like him or not. He doesn't know me either. What matters is that he's the head of state of the United States.
Other world leaders are taking notice of this dynamic. Brazilian President Lula recently called the U.S. tariffs absurd and emphasized that Brazil wants a civilized relationship with the United States, noting that America has a $410 billion trade surplus with Brazil over the past 15 years. These comments highlight how Trump's aggressive trade policies are alienating partners across the hemisphere. The mining industry is already adapting to this new reality. Canadian companies are seeing increased investment in gold and uranium stocks as investors seek safer assets amid trade turmoil. The Canadian government has extended the mineral exploration tax credit and implemented measures to support the mining sector during this challenging period. Ontario has introduced streamlined approval processes specifically targeting the Ring of Fire region, but the human cost of this trade war extends beyond economics. Indigenous communities are watching as their traditional lands become pawns in a geopolitical chess game they never agreed to join. The pressure to fast-track development threatens to repeat historical patterns of exploitation and marginalization that Indigenous peoples have fought for generations to overcome. Mamakwa's constituency includes the mineral-rich Crescent and the First Nations around it, communities that have maintained their connection to the land despite decades of outside pressure. These communities are not anti-development, but they demand respect for their rights and proper consultation processes. The environmental stakes are equally high. The Ring of Fire sits in a remote, swampy peatland that's only accessible by ice road in winter or plane in other months. Any major development would require massive infrastructure projects that could fundamentally alter this pristine ecosystem. The rush to exploit these resources in response to Trump's threats risks environmental damage that could last for generations. Trump's strategy is also undermining American soft power and alliance relationships. By attacking Canada, a country that has stood by the United States through every major conflict and crisis, he's sending a message to other allies that American friendship is worthless when economic interests are at stake. This approach is particularly short-sighted given the global competition for critical minerals and the need for secure, reliable supply chains. The technological implications are staggering. These critical minerals are essential for the energy transition, digital transformation, and national security. Electric vehicle batteries, renewable energy systems, advanced electronics, and military equipment all depend on steady supplies of these materials. By antagonizing the country that can provide them most reliably, Trump is potentially undermining America's technological future. Canadian experts are describing the situation as a dark comedy, but the implications are deadly serious. The suggestion from some quarters is that whoever becomes Canada's prime minister should negotiate a comprehensive mineral deal with the Trump administration, potentially clearing the path for renegotiated trade agreements. The approach would be to bring the two leaders together, create a critical mineral agreement, and then figure out the rest. But this approach assumes Trump is capable of rational negotiation rather than continued escalation. His pattern of behavior suggests he views compromise as weakness and prefers confrontation, even when it damages American interests. The lower tariffs on critical minerals show he understands American dependence, but his public rhetoric and threats suggest he's unable to translate that understanding into effective policy. The Ring of Fire has become a symbol of this broader conflict, a remote region that most Americans have never heard of, but which holds the key to their technological future. Indigenous communities who have stewarded this land for generations are now being told to step aside so it can be exploited in response to American threats. The injustice is obvious, but so is the strategic importance. As this conflict escalates, several trends are becoming clear. First, Trump's aggressive approach is backfiring by revealing American desperation and pushing Canada toward other markets. Second, Indigenous rights are emerging as a major obstacle to the fast-track development both governments want. Third, the environmental and social costs of rushed development could be enormous. Fourth, the global competition for critical minerals is intensifying, making reliable partnerships more valuable than ever. The ultimate irony is that Trump's trade war is achieving the opposite of what he claims to want. Instead of making America stronger and more self-reliant, he's highlighting American weaknesses and dependencies. Instead of bringing jobs back to America, he's disrupting supply chains and raising costs for American consumers. Instead of strengthening American alliances, he's alienating the country's closest partner. Meanwhile, Indigenous communities like those represented by Sol Mamakwa are caught in the middle, watching as their lands become bargaining chips in a trade war they never asked for. Their resistance isn't just about protecting their rights, it's about demanding that any development happen on their terms, with their consent, and for their benefit as well as the broader economy. The Ring of Fire will eventually be developed. The economic pressures are too great and the strategic importance too obvious. But how it's developed, who benefits, and what price is paid in environmental and social terms will depend on whether cooler heads prevail over the current climate of confrontation and threat. Trump's tariff war has exposed the fundamental reality of North American interdependence. Canada has what America needs, America has markets Canada wants, and both countries are stronger when they work together rather than against each other. The Ring of Fire represents both the promise and the peril of this relationship. Massive wealth that can benefit everyone if handled responsibly, or a source of conflict that damages both countries if mismanaged. As this story continues to unfold, one thing is clear. Trump's aggressive tactics are backfiring, revealing American desperation while strengthening Canadian resolve to chart its own course. The Ring of Fire may be remote and largely unknown, but it's become the symbol of a much larger battle over resources, rights, and the future of North American cooperation. The president who promised to make America great again is instead showing the world just how dependent America has become, and how poorly he understands the art of the deal when it comes to treating allies with respect.